Thanks. How do I get this thing going up? Hi, everyone. Good to be here. And good to follow such a great panel that we had now. I think this kind of segues into what I'm talking about and maybe shed some light on why South Africa is falling a bit behind the curve, especially when it compares to East Africa, for example. So the topic I've got there is hashtag data must fall, how South Africa's poor are excluded from the internet. I'll explain the hashtag in a bit. So for those of you who've been to South Africa or know about South Africa, you'll know it's pretty much the most unequal country in the world. Just last week, in fact, Time magazine had this on its front cover saying the world's most unequal country, with an image that's pretty prevalent in South Africa. On the left, you'll see, yeah, it is on the left. On the left, you'll see big houses, pools, big pieces of land, trees, and then separated by just one road, you'll see on the other side thousands and thousands of shacks in what we call an informal settlement. That's an overhead view of Joburg in South Africa. And on the right-hand side, same applies. This is in Durban, I think. So basically, on the left, you'll see an informal settlement that's pushing right up against the border of a golf course, which is no doubt frequented by the elite kind of high-income earners in South Africa. So basically, the Time article itself was based on a World Bank investigation. That's main thrust, I mean, there's loads of data in it, but its main thrust is South Africa is one of, if not the most unequal country in the world by any measure. What this means is that 10% of the population owns 90% of the wealth, which you can kind of see from this image. There's probably, on the left, there's probably 30 families who share the wealth on that side, while on the other side you'll see thousands and thousands of people who live with almost nothing. We have a huge percentage of very poor, but we also have a lot of high income earners and a very small middle class. So there's a high level of income polarization. Obviously, as a legacy of apartheid, this is very much divided along racial lines. You can almost guarantee that a lot of the people who are living on the left-hand side there are white. And you can pretty much guarantee that 100% of the people living on the right are Black African. And not enough has changed since 1994 when we had our first democratic elections. The only thing that's really changed is that on the left, you'll get some really rich elite Black people, but we haven't done enough to bring the very poor up into the middle class. So this polarization affects all spheres of life in South Africa. Education, you'll find really good schools, amazing world-class schools, and really terrible schools with no facilities. You see it in hospitals, you see it in roads, you see it across all spheres, and it includes the internet. Because we have quite a lot of sort of what we say is first world infrastructure, accessibility is not really the problem in South Africa. Unless you go very deep rural places, you'll get some kind of coverage on your mobile phone because they've built the infrastructure to meet the needs of that 10%. But the real barrier to entry is the prohibitively expensive cost of data. I know it was briefly mentioned in the panel before, but in South Africa, it's even more extreme. So the cost of 1 gig of data in South Africa is about $10. Which is really expensive, but that's if you're buying a gig on its own. To compare, I mean, it's a lot more expensive than Germany, for example, but it's 7 times more expensive than 1 gig in Egypt, and nearly 3 times the cost of that same gig of data in Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria. What makes this even weirder is that, in, for example, Nigeria, we have the same mobile providers. In fact, they are South African companies, a lot of them. But they go to the other country and charge what the market demands there while overcharging people in South Africa. Why this happens is because post-1994, when Madiba came into power, and sort of business took off in South Africa, it also coincided with the sort of cell phone era coming into existence in the early 90s. Basically, two massive corporate-backed companies came in. This was Vodacom and MTN, and did a land grab and took over all the mobile country, put up base stations everywhere, obviously focusing on the urban areas, and as businesses focused on the 10% that owned the 90% of the wealth. So basically, since 1994, there's been one more entrant into this kind of cartel, Cell C, but they've operated as a cartel. They've pushed the prices up to meet the demand of that 10% because there was no other option. That 10% had a lot of disposable income, so they pushed the prices up as much as they possibly could in order to boost their profits. But what this meant for the 90% is that their pricing models were completely anti-poor. So if you want to buy 1 gig, it's $10, right? But in South Africa, if you are the people living in the townships, in the informal settlements, you're never going to have $10 disposable income to spend on data, because that is a daily wage. So what they did was broke down and especially with prepaid, this is not talking about contracts and things like that, because the people in the townships without high incomes couldn't access contracts. So they could only get prepaid. But they broke it down to such an extent that they went to the lowest possible data bundle that people could buy and priced it in a way that just made no sense to normal economics, you know? So basically, the lowest data bundle you can buy is 15 megabytes. And as you know, 15 megabytes is nothing. You can send a couple of messages on that, but beyond that, you can't really do anything with it. But that's costed at about 70 US cents for that 15 megabytes. If you extrapolate that to be a gig, that's over $45 a gig, which, as you can imagine, is just impossible for someone in these townships to afford. For an example, that $45 is the same as I pay at my house for a monthly contract for an uncapped fiber line, high-speed fiber line, $45, and that gets me all the internet I need at my house. It's still expensive compared to lots of other places in the world, but it's a lot more than paying $45 for a gig over the month. To put it into more perspective, the minimum wage in South Africa is only $240 a month, and that's if you're fully employed. That doesn't take into account people who work day to day or have part-time employment or informally employed. So what this means is that users are spending more than 20% of their monthly income on 1 gig of mobile data. And I mean, 1 gig of mobile data in a month is hardly excessive internet use. You know, it's just basically getting by on the internet. So basically, yeah, this is serving to grow the digital divide further. So instead of the internet bringing people closer together in South Africa, it's dragging people further apart, because people who are on the 10% are fully digitized. They are online all the time, on their mobile phones, doing their business, getting better educated, while people in the poorer areas are getting left further and further behind as digitization increases. So this has obviously started to get a lot of attention in the South African press. And as social media grows, and as we get a better sense of what else is happening in the world, as the East African kind of digital boom happens and South Africa is getting left behind, this is getting more and more attention. So this is like, for example, a cartoon that was in a newspaper saying, I'm applying for a loan. The lady behind the counter says, will it be for a house or a car? And the woman says, for data. And I know it's like a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke thing, but when you are paying 20% of your data of your monthly income, and in fact, research has shown that people are paying up to 40% of their monthly income just on mobile data. And that's not even going up to getting a gig in a month. It could be less than that. What this is also doing, and kind of was spoken about in the previous panel with the kind of digital economy, is that because of this high cost, it's creating a self-imposed walled garden. What I mean by this is that people, if you have 15 megabytes of data that you can use for that day or for a couple of days, you can't go and just do a deep dive into the internet and go onto YouTube for hours, look for jobs. You can't really do much research. You can't do anything. All people are doing is using WhatsApp to maybe message the employers to say, I'm going to be late for work because there's a taxi strike, the train has broken down, which is really a day-to-day example of what's happening in South Africa too, that people are just using it just to get by so they don't lose their job. Have a little bit of data on your phone so I can message my job and say, I'm going to be late because of this. And then they want to stay connected to the world. So Facebook is obviously hugely prevalent. And I think, although it's not in fact the world garden, it becomes self-imposed. And I think there are lots of examples in countries all over the world, for example, Myanmar, where Facebook becomes the internet, where it becomes the de facto internet, and that has its own issues that come up, especially in this age of misinformation and things like that. What makes it worse also is that the mobile operators, in response to the kind of calls for the data prices to fall, their response is to be zero rating. So, of course, Facebook have come in and offered free basics on the mobile phones. So again, it just kind of reinforces this walled garden effect that people are only using the internet for the small little section of what it is. It's not really using the internet for all its power. It's just using it for these basic services. So this gave rise to what's called the data must fall movement. So the must fall kind of part of it is the de facto kind of social protest hashtag in South Africa. Started with fees must fall a couple of years back in response to university fees getting more and more expensive. Again, the poor were being excluded from the ability to go to university. So the fees must fall protest started, and it was really successful in changing the government's view on university fees, and now the lowest end of the South African economy can access free tuition universities, or at least low-cost universities. So these kind of movements have had a massive effect. So the data must fall movement started in 2016, led by civil society and public figures, and it's basically against what I've been speaking about, the hugely anti-poor and high costs, and for the unfair models. For example, what this guy's speaking about is the model that the less you buy, the quicker your data expires. So if I pay for a gig of data, why should I have to use it in 7 days? Did I not buy to use it when and where I want? Does the data go bad after 7 days? And there's been campaigns around that when ISP came out saying data isn't like milk, it doesn't go off. There's no reason why you should be able to buy data and then it just disappears if you don't use it in time. For example, that 15 meg data bundle that I was talking about earlier expires after 1 day. So you're forced to keep buying 15 megs a day and end up spending $45 a month to get that 1 gig of data. Because people are not really weighing up whether to buy data or to consume media in another way. They're weighing up whether to buy data or to get their child to school, or to buy school clothes, or to keep their family fed for that day. So on that hierarchy of needs, data's well down the line, but the way that things are priced in South Africa at the moment, it's just making it impossible for them to get digitized. Koketsa Moeti is high up in Amandla.mobi, which is one of the leading civil society groups that drove the data must fall movement, and she says a lot more eloquently than I've said what I'm talking about in terms of anti-poor. She says our contention is that low-income consumers pay a poverty premium as mobile network operators use price discrimination, charging more for small data bundles. So that's really been the biggest thrust of this thing, is that this poverty, people are paying a poverty premium, that the poorest people are paying the most to get the internet. And this has also seen some success and some really recent success. As you can see, this tweet is from just 2 weeks ago, or last week. Basically, what happened was they set up a national commission of inquiry, a government-backed National Commission of Inquiry with the Competition Commission, which is basically the antitrust cartel kind of watchdog. And yeah, so the voices are heard, and basically their inquiry has come out and agreed with the movement that that these networks have been anti-poor, and they have to change the regulations around how their pricing works. So this has been a big big success. We don't really know what's going to come of it because it's so new. The mobile networks have already tried to get around it through various regulations. So I think it's going to be a bit of a legal battle for the rest of the year. But at least it's a step forward in kind of everyone acknowledging that, yes, the poor are being completely excluded from the internet because of these prices. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But in the meantime, while all of this was happening, there were a lot of kind of alternatives brewing that people were coming up with to get around these high data prices. So one of them is an organization called Project Isizwe, which started about five years ago. And basically that's a non-profit that works with the public and private sector to bring internet access to low-income communities. So what Project Isizwe did is went to government, specifically to city municipalities, and said, you need to treat internet access like a basic human right, like you would water and electricity. Every citizen should get a basic daily quota of internet access like you would with water and electricity. So they worked with government to put free Wi-Fi spots in kind of government and public areas, so schools, libraries, clinics, town squares, transport hubs, anywhere where people are congregating already. They weren't going into people's houses, but basically saying that every person should get a basic daily quota. And this came about through the Tshwane Free Wi-Fi project. So Tshwane is the capital city of South Africa, otherwise known as Pretoria. And they put up more than 1,000 free public hotspots around the city in the townships. Offering 500 megs per day for free to every single device that connected could get access to 500 megs. So 6 gigs a month. I mean, it was a lot of, sorry, is that right? 30? Anyway, a lot of gigs a month, a lot more than they could afford on their own. Now they're embarking on another campaign that's off the back of the Commission of Inquiry. One of the findings that they came out with, or one of the new regulations, is that people can now donate data to other numbers. So if I've got excess data on my contract at the end of the month, I can donate it to another number. How they are using this to their advantage is setting up routers that are based off of mobile SIM cards, routers in low-income communities, and driving people to donate that excess data to these routers so that they can become a part of the solution and give their excess data that they're not using for users to use in these low-income communities. So that was quite a sort of government-focused solution. This is a much more business-focused solution, Too Much Wi-Fi, and basically they are working like a township ISP. They deliver affordable premium internet to homes and businesses in underserved urban communities, delivering 20 times more bandwidth value. So what they do is go put routers themselves in the townships, but they use what we call spaza shops, the sort of community shops in the areas, and individuals in their homes. They go put a router at these locations. The guy, whoever is there, pays whatever a month, say $50 a month, to get access to the uncapped Wi-Fi, but then he becomes a reseller for his community. So it's a really nice model in that it drives internet adoption, but it also drives economic development and digital skills in the community, as these spaza shop owners can become resellers of Wi-Fi, and they kind of drive the adoption. Having those local ambassadors, I think, is a really important part of this, that it's not a corporate solution. You driving it at a community level, and people in these townships become the ambassadors for Wi-Fi, show people how to use it, how to get on, what's possible on Wi-Fi, run their business. So another really nice model that's done a great case study in a township in Cape Town, but is growing all the time. And then the last two models, I mean, there are countless others, but the last two I want to focus on are kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. Rain is kind of a big corporate-backed ISP that wants to take on Vodacom and MTN's oligopoly, and basically just a data-only network, no voice, at reasonable rates, sort of a third of the price of what those networks are offering, and none of the kind of stipulations, regulations of expiry, contracts, things like that. They're also pioneering SA's first 5G network. They're a little bit sort of middle income focused, so how much this reaches the sort of poorest of the poor, I'm not sure, but any kind of competition is good to help drive the price down. Then at the other end of the spectrum is Senzaleni, a community telecoms organization. And basically they are doing community owned and run, training up users in the most rural areas about Wi-Fi to run themselves. So a really nice kind of community driven. Any of you have been to these kind of talks before, might have met Carlos Rey Moreno. He speaks a lot about it, and they're doing great works in the community. So just to end off where we can possibly go from here, India is quite a good example to follow because they also have such an unequal society, much bigger economy and much more people. But from their side, competition among mobile networks has seen data costs decrease by 95% in the last, between 2013 and 2017, which has nearly doubled the amount of internet users. So hopefully in South Africa, with these increase of these alternative models and the sort of crackdown on the big mobile operators, we will see the regulation of the anti-poor pricing and see competition increase. So we're hoping for a similar kind of digital revolution that India is seeing, that East Africa is seeing, that'll go some way to close the digital divide and hopefully close the gap to some extent, and we'll start to get on the Time magazine for the right reasons. Cool. I think that's me. Any questions? No? Over here.
So I have a question, which is related to when you have the data and you're using a service like Facebook, which is really heavy, that it's just using up your bandwidth. Have people start considering other services which are much lighter? So I know there's Facebook Messenger Lite, but there's other services which are really super light, so you're not using as much bandwidth, and they're probably better suited to that environment.
There are sort of some coming into the market. In fact, there's one company called Binu that's gaining traction, and basically they reverse charge data. So they take any website and completely skin it to be as low cost as possible, but then they reverse charge it to advertisers, who then every 5 minutes there's a pop-up. So it's a little bit of a difficult system, but it's getting a lot of traction because people aren't using any data and it's getting charged to someone else. But that's where, I mean, Facebook, it is a data-heavy application, but that's why these mobile operators are coming with the free basics and things like that. In South Africa, there's not a lot. There used to be a lot when in the sort of feature phone era, there was a big application called Mixit, which was absolutely huge before the smartphone era, but it never really made the jump to smartphones. So, Facebook and WhatsApp are hugely prevalent at this stage. Anyone else? No?
Hello?
Oh, hi.
Hi. Here. The other side. Hi.
There, sorry.
So I'm from India, and like you said, we've had a reduction in the cost of data right now, and it started off when a local company, Reliance, which is actually pretty big, came up with their own telecom services. So, but the price that India paid was with data. I mean, private data.
Yeah.
So, like right now, not only is this company the owner of like vast amount of personal data, but what they have done for getting this price down is connected it with our digital identity system that India has put in place through the government. So my question is that while we're talking about how to get this more access to another population in the world and reduce the digital divide, is there a conversation there about data privacy or how to do it in a more democratic manner where there's also data sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think South Africa's got sort of to the point of linking things to a kind of digital identity. So it's going to be, I think it's going to come up a lot in the kind of conversation. Right now, it's so focused on price that people are willing to give up a little bit of privacy to get the cost down. But I definitely think it's going to become more, as these new models come into the system. For example, what I was speaking about now with this advertising model, it's definitely going to be scraping some data to get it. So it's going to be interesting to see what the cost versus privacy kind of trade-off is going to be. I don't know what that's going to be at this stage. What I do know is that they're linking a lot, the mobile operators together with the sort of free basics are linking a lot of content to the service. So as a lot of VAS services are coming, that you get some kind of bespoke free messenger with it that probably has a lot of private, that you get video downloads that are somehow gauged to your interests, you know, so they're definitely sort of coming into the system. But right now, the conversation hasn't really been around privacy in South Africa. It's purely a price-driven conversation right now.
Thanks. So I understand this is mainly a political question of getting the prices down, but I wonder whether for us that build websites and that build apps, and we get all the requirements from the client to say, oh, there need to be these really big high-definition images. Are there any kind of benchmarks that we could use to say, if you want to reach people in South Africa or similar countries, this is how the website should, this is how light it should be?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, first thing to know is that mobile penetration is massive in South Africa. I mean, there are more mobile numbers than there are people. And smartphones are starting to come into the market. Sort of low-end smartphones in South Africa cost about $50, which is a lot, but it's little compared to the amount you're spending on data. So building things for desktop in a South African context, especially in the low-income context, is pretty pointless. And yeah, anything video content is very difficult. So I'm sure there are more specifics. Sorry, I'm not very technically minded, so I can't give you exact specs on what it could be. But it's definitely a low data, sort of very low-end Android. The lowest end Huawei devices are probably the most prevalent. So it's quite easy data to find in terms of which devices are the most prevalent there. It's those basic, that ones that can just about handle WhatsApp and Facebook. But sorry, I can't give you much more technical detail. Last one, yeah.
My question is concerning these technical details.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I just wonder about the distributors. Like, how come they had that kind of monopole status for so long? Why didn't the market react to the need of data, or was it like a legal thing? That
it was basically a regulatory thing, and also they owned all the infrastructure because they came in first and basically put in all the base stations that they owned themselves. So it wasn't like there was any kind of existing system of a mobile base station. It was This is owned by MTN and Vodacom, and they basically rented it and no one else could touch it. So they pretty much owned the land. It's only now that the sort of, I think the economy has matured enough in terms of a digital sense that it's made sense for people like Rain, who I've mentioned here, to build their own base stations. But a lot of it was regulatory, but I think, yeah, mainly they got in there first with a lot of money and it was just too expensive for anyone to sort of compete. Cool, thank you everyone.
We